They laughed when I pulled up in my beat-up Honda, rust spots decorating the wheel wells like medals of honor from 15 winters on Michigan roads. The inspection sticker had expired 3 months ago, and my brother Jake had been nagging me weekly about getting it renewed. "Sarah, you can't keep driving around with that thing," he'd say, pointing at the faded orange sticker on my windshield. "One of these days a cop's gonna notice." But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. So here I was at Riverside Auto Service on a Tuesday morning, watching three mechanics huddle around the coffee machine like conspirators planning their next move. They'd already given my car the once-over from their positions by the bay doors, and I could see the dollar signs calculating behind their eyes. The oldest one, a barrel-chested man with Tony embroidered on his coveralls, was clearly the ringleader. His two sidekicks looked younger, hungrier, with the kind of predatory enthusiasm that comes from working commission. What they didn't know, what nobody in this small Michigan town knew, was that the quiet woman in the faded jeans and oversized sweater had once been responsible for keeping a fleet of armored vehicles running in conditions that would make their worst nightmares look like a Sunday drive. The waiting area of Riverside Auto Service smelled like motor oil, stale coffee, and the particular brand of masculine confidence that comes from assuming you know more than everyone else in the room. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in that harsh white glow that makes even healthy people look slightly ill. The chairs were cracked vinyl, probably older than the youngest mechanic working here, and the magazines scattered across the cracked coffee table were from some time during the Obama administration. I'd chosen a seat near the window where I could watch them work on my car, though work might be too generous a term for what was happening. Tony had popped the hood and was pointing at various components, while his apprentices nodded along like eager students. Even from here, I could see the performance they were putting on, the exaggerated head shaking, the concerned murmurs designed to travel just far enough to reach anxious customers. My Honda Civic wasn't much to look at, I'll give them that. The paint had faded from what was once a respectable navy blue to something closer to primer gray, and the rear bumper bore the scars of a dozen parking lot encounters. The upholstery had given up trying to be impressive somewhere around the 150,000-mile mark, and the air conditioning had been more of a suggestion than a feature for the past 2 summers. But underneath that battle-worn exterior was an engine I'd maintained myself, transmission fluid I'd changed religiously, and brake pads I'd replaced just last month in my own driveway. Tony emerged from under the hood, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better decades. He walked toward the waiting area with the slow, measured pace of someone delivering bad news, his expression arranged in what he probably thought was sympathetic concern. Behind him, his two apprentices exchanged glances that suggested they were about to witness a masterclass in creative automotive diagnosis. "Ma'am," Tony said, settling into the chair across from me with a grunt, "I'm afraid we've got some issues here." I looked up from my phone, where I'd been reading about the latest developments in hybrid engine technology, and gave him my full attention. "Oh? Yeah, it's not good." He shook his head slowly, the way people do when they're about to deliver news that's going to cost you money. "Your brake pads are shot, completely worn down to nothing. Dangerous to drive, really. And your timing belt's about ready to snap. That happens while you're driving, you're looking at serious engine damage." I nodded thoughtfully, digesting this information. "Interesting. When did you say you checked the brake pads?" "Just now, when I had the car up on the lift." He gestured toward the bay where my Civic sat, looking forlorn under the harsh work lights. "Probably haven't been changed in years from the look of them." "And the timing belt?" "Cracked, frayed, could go any minute." Tony was warming to his theme now, settling back in his chair with the confidence of a man who'd delivered this speech countless times to countless women who wouldn't know a timing belt from a timing chain. "Look, I don't like being the bearer of bad news, but safety's got to come first, you know. These aren't the kind of things you want to put off." From the service bay, I could hear his apprentices moving around my car, probably identifying additional problems that would require immediate attention. The younger one, whose name tag read Brad, was peering intently at my exhaust system with the kind of focused concentration usually reserved for archaeological discoveries. He stood up and caught Tony's attention, making a subtle gesture that clearly communicated another expensive discovery. "And your front tires are showing some uneven wear patterns," Tony continued, without missing a beat. "Could be an alignment issue, could be your struts going bad. We'd want to put it on the alignment rack, check everything out. That's another diagnostic fee, but better to know what we're dealing with, right?" I finished writing and looked up at him with what I hoped was the expression of a concerned car owner facing unexpected expenses. "This is a lot more than I was expecting to spend today." "I understand, believe me."
Tony's voice carried what sounded like genuine sympathy, though the effect was somewhat undermined by the way his eyes kept flicking toward the service bay, where his team was undoubtedly discovering additional profitable problems. But here's the thing, these aren't really optional repairs. The brakes especially, that's a safety issue. I'd hate to see you get hurt because we let you drive out of here knowing there was a problem. It was a neat psychological trick, wrapping financial pressure in the language of concern and responsibility. The implication was clear. Any reasonable person would prioritize safety over money, and questioning his diagnosis would mark me as either foolish or reckless. The fact that I'd replaced those brake pads myself just 3 weeks ago, using premium ceramic pads that should last another 50,000 miles, was apparently irrelevant to this narrative. "Let me ask you something," I said, closing my notebook and leaning forward slightly. "When you checked my brake pads, did you actually remove the wheels, or were you looking through the spokes?" Tony's confident expression flickered for just a moment. "Well, visual inspection is usually sufficient to identify wear patterns, because if you'd actually removed the wheels and looked at the pads themselves, you'd have noticed that they're still well within manufacturer specifications. The wear indicators aren't even close to the rotors." The waiting area fell quiet, except for the buzz of fluorescent lights and the distant sounds of air tools from other service bays. Tony's face went through several interesting transitions, from confusion to suspicion, to the dawning realization that his morning might not go according to plan. "Ma'am, I've been doing this for 20 years, he said, his voice taking on a slightly defensive edge. "I think I know worn brake pads when I see them." "I'm sure you do." I stood up and walked toward the window overlooking the service bay, where Brad and Rick were now huddled in what appeared to be an urgent consultation. "Brad, Tony, could we talk to you for a minute?" "I'm busy," he replied, without taking his eyes off me. "Yeah, but this is about the inspection. There's something we need to show you." The tension in Tony's jaw suggested he was well aware that whatever Brad needed to show him was unlikely to improve his day. But he also couldn't ignore his employees, especially not with a customer who had already demonstrated an uncomfortable familiarity with automotive systems standing right in front of him. "Excuse me," he said to me, his politeness now strained to the breaking point. "I'll be right back." I watched him walk into the service bay, where Brad and Rick immediately surrounded him in what looked like an urgent conversation. Their voices were low, but their body language spoke volumes. Lots of pointing at my car, lots of gestures that seemed to indicate confusion or concern. At one point, Rick pulled out his phone and appeared to be showing Tony something on the screen. The conversation stretched on for several minutes, growing more animated as it progressed. I could see Tony's shoulders tense, could see him shaking his head in what looked like disbelief or frustration. Whatever his employees were telling him, it wasn't aligning with the narrative he'd been building about my car's desperate need for expensive repairs. Finally, Tony broke away from the group and walked back toward the waiting area, where Brad and Rick remained by my car, watching the unfolding drama with the fascination of people witnessing a traffic accident. "So," I said, as he settled back into his chair, "how did that conversation go?" Tony was quiet for a moment, studying my face, as if he was seeing me clearly for the first time. My guys tell me you've got some aftermarket modifications under the hood. Performance air intake, upgraded cooling system, professional installation. That's correct. They also tell me your rotors have been recently resurfaced and your pads are definitely new. High-end ceramic, not the standard organic compounds. Also correct. He leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from combative to something approaching cautious respect. So I guess my question is, why bring your car here for inspection when you obviously know enough to maintain it yourself? The truth was simple enough. My brother Jake had recommended Riverside Auto Service, claiming they were honest and fair.
Jake meant well, but his idea of automotive expertise extended to checking his oil every few months and hoping for the best. He'd probably never experienced the particular brand of creative diagnosis that seemed to be this shop's specialty. Because my inspection sticker expired and I needed a new one, I said simply. I wasn't expecting a sales presentation. Tony nodded slowly, processing this information. Around us, the waiting area had taken on the quality of a stage set between acts, everything arranged properly but missing the energy that would bring it to life. The coffee machine gurgled to itself in the corner, and somewhere in the building, a radio played classic rock at a volume just loud enough to be annoying. "Look," Tony said finally, "maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. Sometimes in this business, you see so many cars that are genuinely neglected that you start assuming the worst. Your car's obviously been well maintained. We can get that inspection done for you, no problem." It was as close to an apology as I was likely to get, and probably more than I'd expected when the conversation started. But there was something in his tone, a careful quality that suggested this wasn't quite over. He was still trying to figure out exactly who he was dealing with, still calculating the safest path forward. "I appreciate that," I replied. "Though I'm curious about something. When you first looked at my car, before you knew about my maintenance records, what made you think I'd accept your diagnosis without question?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications neither of us wanted to address directly. Tony's face went through several expressions before settling on something that might charitably be called embarrassment. "Honestly," he sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair, "most people don't know much about cars. They trust us to tell them what's wrong and what it costs to fix. You don't usually get customers who can spot the difference between a timing belt and a timing chain." "And you assumed I'd be most people?" "Yeah, I guess I did." It wasn't exactly a confession of attempted fraud, but it was an acknowledgement of the assumptions that had guided his approach to our interaction. The implication was clear. He'd sized me up as an easy mark, someone unlikely to question his expertise or challenge his recommendations. The fact that I'd turned out to be something different had clearly caught him off guard. From the service bay, I could hear the sound of my car being lowered from the lift, the hydraulic whine of machinery returning to its resting position. Brad appeared in the doorway again, this time holding a clipboard and looking considerably more subdued than he had during his earlier theatrical performance. "Inspection's done. Everything checks out fine. New stickers on the windshield." Tony stood up, clearly eager to conclude our interaction before it could become any more uncomfortable. "There you go, all set." I gathered my purse and notebook, preparing to leave, but found myself hesitating. There was something about this moment, about the way Tony and his crew had so quickly shifted from predatory confidence to wary respect, that felt incomplete. They'd learned something about making assumptions, but I wasn't sure the lesson would stick once I was gone and the next unsuspecting customer pulled into their bay. "Can I ask you something before I go?" I said, turning back to Tony. He nodded, though his expression suggested he was bracing for another uncomfortable question. "How many customers do you think drive out of here believing they need repairs they don't actually need?" The question hit like a physical blow. Tony's face flushed red again, and behind him, I could see Brad and Rick exchanging glances that suggested this wasn't a topic they were comfortable discussing. "I don't know what you're implying," Tony said carefully. "I'm not implying anything. I'm asking a direct question about your business practices." The silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of things that couldn't be said directly. Tony was caught between defending his livelihood and acknowledging what we both knew to be true. His employees were watching from the service bay, waiting to see how his boss would handle this unprecedented challenge to their established routine. We recommend repairs based on manufacturer guidelines and industry standards. Sometimes that means preventative maintenance that might seem unnecessary to customers who don't understand the technical complexities involved. It was a masterful piece of bureaucratic doublespeak, technically accurate while completely avoiding the substance of my question. He was admitting nothing while defending everything, a verbal dance that probably served him well when dealing with customer complaints or potential legal issues. I see. And in your professional opinion, were the brake pad replacement and timing belt service you recommended for my car based on manufacturer guidelines and industry standards? Tony's jaw worked silently for a moment. He was trapped now, caught between his earlier diagnosis and the reality that his employees had discovered. Admitting that his recommendations had been wrong would undermine his credibility. Defending them would require him to argue against evidence that everyone in the room could verify. Each situation is different, he said eventually. What looks like adequate maintenance to one person might seem insufficient to someone with different standards. It was another non-answer, but I could see the strain it was taking for him to maintain this level of diplomatic evasion. His employees were still watching from the service bay, and I had the sense that this conversation was being evaluated on multiple levels. Tony wasn't just defending his business practices to an angry customer. He was also demonstrating to his staff how to handle challenges to their authority. "Well," I said, shouldering my purse and preparing to leave, "I suppose that's one way to look at it." I walked toward the service bay to collect my car keys, passing Brad and Rick, who suddenly found their shoes fascinating. Neither of them made eye contact, but I could feel them watching me in their peripheral vision, probably wondering what other surprises this quiet Tuesday morning might hold. My Honda sat in the bay looking exactly as I had left it, except for the fresh inspection sticker glowing orange and new on the windshield. Someone had closed the hood and returned my floor mats to their proper positions, small courtesies that suggested a desire to conclude our business relationship on the most positive note possible. "Keys are in the ignition," Brad offered quietly as I approached. "Thank you." I slid behind the wheel and started the engine, listening to the smooth idle that came from proper maintenance and quality parts. The radio came on automatically, playing something forgettable and cheerful that seemed completely out of place given the tension I was leaving behind. As I backed out of the service bay, I could see Tony and his crew watching from the waiting area window. Their body language suggested they were already discussing what had just happened, probably trying to figure out exactly where their routine customer interaction had gone so dramatically off script. I paused at the end of the driveway, waiting for traffic to clear so I could pull onto the main road. In my rearview mirror, Riverside Auto Service looked like a dozen other independent shops scattered across small-town America. Modest building, hand-painted signs, the kind of place that survived on local reputation and repeat customers. From the outside, there was nothing to suggest the particular brand of creative automotive diagnosis I'd just experienced. But as I pulled into traffic and headed home, I found myself thinking about all the customers who hadn't questioned their mechanic's recommendations, all the people who'd driven away believing they'd just avoided catastrophic engine failure thanks to timely intervention from experts they trusted. How many unnecessary brake jobs had been performed in that bay? How many perfectly functional timing chains had been replaced with identical timing chains at $1,200 a pop? The mathematics were depressing to contemplate. Tony had the confident delivery of someone who'd perfected his pitch through repetition, and his employees had moved through their supporting roles with the smooth coordination that comes from practice. This wasn't their first attempt at creative diagnosis, and unless something fundamental changed, it wouldn't be their last. My phone buzzed with a text message from Jake. "How'd the inspection go? Told you Tony was good, people." I stared at the message for a moment before responding. "Got my sticker. Interesting experience." It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Jake had recommended Riverside Auto Service based on his own limited interactions with them, probably oil changes and tire rotations that didn't offer much opportunity for creative upselling.
He'd never experienced the full Tony treatment because he'd never presented as a vulnerable target. But as I drove through the familiar streets of my small Michigan town, past the hardware store where I bought my automotive supplies and the coffee shop where I sometimes worked on my laptop, I realized that my morning at Riverside Auto Service was about to become something more than just an unpleasant customer experience. Because tomorrow morning, I had a very different kind of appointment, one that would put Tony's assumptions about quiet competence to a much more dramatic test. The irony was almost poetic. Tony and his crew had dismissed me as just another clueless customer, someone they could easily manipulate with technical-sounding diagnoses and appeals to safety concerns. They'd never bothered to ask who I was or what I might know about the systems they claimed to understand. If they had asked, they might have learned that the woman in the faded jeans and oversized sweater wasn't just someone who knew how to maintain her own car. They might have discovered that she'd spent the last 15 years working in a very different kind of garage, one where the stakes were considerably higher than a failed inspection sticker. But they hadn't asked, and now they were about to get a lesson in the dangers of making assumptions about quiet competence. Because tomorrow morning, Admiral Patricia Thompson was scheduled to arrive for an unannounced inspection of local automotive service facilities, and Riverside Auto Service was first on her list.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But as I settled into my home office and opened my laptop, I wasn't thinking about maintaining my civilian cover anymore. I was thinking about the systematic fraud I'd witnessed, about my brother's misplaced trust, and about the dozens of other customers who'd probably walked out of Riverside Auto Service lighter in the wallet and none the wiser about what had just happened to them. The Government Fleet Services database, loaded with the familiar efficiency of military-grade software, displaying contract summaries, audit schedules, and compliance reports in neat digital rows. Riverside Auto Service appeared on page 3, listed as an approved vendor for light maintenance and inspection services. Their contract had been renewed automatically each year based on satisfactory performance ratings, though those ratings were based on customer surveys that most people never bothered to complete. I scrolled through their service history, noting the steady increase in average billing per vehicle over the past 18 months. Not dramatic enough to trigger automatic audits, but significant enough to suggest either improving thoroughness or creative interpretation of maintenance requirements. Given my morning experience, I had a pretty good idea which explanation was more likely accurate. The beauty of unannounced inspections was that they captured businesses in their natural state before they had time to adjust their practices or coach their employees. Tomorrow morning, Tony and his crew would be expecting another routine day of creative diagnosis and profitable repairs. Instead, they'd be getting a comprehensive audit of their procedures, their billing practices, and their compliance with federal service standards. I spent the next hour reviewing the inspection protocols, cross-referencing federal regulations with standard automotive practices, and preparing the documentation that would be required if the audit uncovered evidence of systematic fraud. It was methodical work, the kind of detailed preparation that had defined my military career, but there was a personal edge to it now that made the process feel different. The phone rang again around dinner time, a number I didn't recognize with a local area code. "Miss Thompson?" The voice was tentative, younger than I expected. "This is Brad from Riverside Auto Service. I hope you don't mind me calling." I felt my eyebrows rise. This was unexpected. "What can I do for you, Brad?" "Well, I wanted to apologize for this morning. The way Tony handled your inspection, it wasn't right. You obviously know your stuff about cars, and we should have recognized that from the start." There was genuine discomfort in his voice, the kind of awkwardness that comes from realizing you've been part of something you're not proud of. I found myself curious about what had prompted this call, what had motivated a junior employee to reach out to a customer who'd basically accused his boss of fraud. "I appreciate that, Brad. Can I ask what made you decide to call?" "Honestly, after you left, Tony was pretty angry about how things went. He kept saying you'd made him look bad in front of the crew, that you were just showing off with technical knowledge you'd probably learned from YouTube videos. But you didn't agree? Brad was quiet for a moment, and I could hear the sounds of traffic in the background, suggesting he was calling from somewhere away from the shop. The thing is, I've been working on cars since I was 16, and I've never seen modifications like what you've got under your hood. That intake system isn't something you order from a catalog. It's custom work, professional grade, the kind of stuff you see on race cars or military vehicles. My pulse quickened slightly. Brad had obviously spent more time examining my engine than I'd realized, and his observation was uncomfortably accurate. The performance modifications I'd installed weren't exactly military specification, but they were based on systems I'd worked with during my years maintaining fleet vehicles in challenging environments. And that got you thinking? Yeah, it got me thinking that maybe we made some assumptions about you that were wrong, really wrong. There was something in his tone that suggested this conversation was heading somewhere specific, that Brad hadn't just called to apologize for his boss's behavior. He was building toward something, working up the courage to ask a question or share information that felt important to him. Brad, is there something else you wanted to tell me? There is, actually. His voice dropped slightly, taking on the careful quality of someone sharing sensitive information. You asked Tony about how many customers drive out of here thinking they need repairs they don't actually need. I remember. Well, the honest answer is most of them. Tony's got this whole system worked out. Different approaches for different types of customers. Women get the safety angle, older folks get the reliability pitch, young people get the performance upgrade sales. He's been training me and Rick on how to spot easy targets and what kind of problems to find with their cars. The admission hung in the air between us, carrying weight that went beyond a simple customer service complaint. Brad was describing systematic fraud, a deliberate business model built on deception and exploitation. More importantly, he was describing it to someone who just demonstrated intimate knowledge of automotive systems and zero tolerance for being manipulated. That's a serious accusation, Brad. I know it is, and I know I shouldn't be telling you this, especially over the phone. But after this morning, after seeing how you handled Tony's sales pitch, I started thinking about how many people we've ripped off who didn't know enough to fight back. And that bothers you? It bothers me a lot. I got into this business because I like working on cars, because I wanted to help people keep their vehicles running safely. What we're doing isn't helping anyone except Tony's bank account. I found myself genuinely impressed by Brad's moral clarity, especially given the pressure he was probably under to go along with his employer's questionable practices. It takes real courage to acknowledge that you've been part of something wrong, even more courage to take action to address it. So what are you planning to do about it? I don't know, admitted he. I mean, I need this job, and Tony's got connections all over town. If I cross him, I'll probably have trouble finding work anywhere else in the area. But I also can't keep participating in what we're doing to people. Have you talked to Rick about any of this? Rick knows exactly what's going on, but he doesn't care as long as the commission checks keep coming. He's got 2 kids and a mortgage, and he's convinced himself that we're providing a service by catching problems before they become emergencies. It was a rationalization I'd heard before, the kind of mental gymnastics people perform to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths about their own behavior.
Rick had found a way to frame fraud as customer service, probably sleeping better at night by focusing on the theoretical benefits rather than the actual harm. Brad, can I ask you something? Sure. If someone were to investigate Tony's business practices, would you be willing to cooperate? The line went quiet for so long that I wondered if the call had been dropped. When Brad finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled, as if he were weighing each word before speaking it. Are you asking hypothetically, or is there something specific you're thinking about? Let's call it hypothetical for now. Hypothetically, yeah, I think I would, especially if there was some kind of protection for employees who came forward. Tony's not just cheating customers. He's creating a toxic work environment where honesty is discouraged and fraud is rewarded. That's not sustainable long term. I appreciate your honesty, Brad, and I want you to know that your call means something to me, regardless of what happens next.
Thanks, Miss Thompson. And again, I'm sorry about this morning. You deserved better treatment than what you got from us. After Brad hung up, I sat in my kitchen staring at my phone and thinking about the moral complexity of the situation I'd stumbled into. On one level, this was exactly the kind of systematic fraud that my new position was designed to detect and address. Riverside Auto Service was bilking federal agencies along with private customers, using their government contracts to legitimize a business model built on deception. But on another level, this was personal. Tony and his crew had tried to cheat me, had dismissed me as an easy mark, and were probably doing the same thing to dozens of other people every week. They were parasites feeding on the trust that held small communities together, and they were counting on their victims' ignorance to protect them from consequences. I opened my laptop again and began drafting a preliminary inspection report, documenting the attempted fraud I'd witnessed and outlining the areas that would require detailed investigation during tomorrow's audit. It was careful, methodical work, but there was an edge of anticipation to it that I hadn't felt in months. For the first time since leaving active duty, I was about to use my authority for something that felt genuinely important, not just bureaucratic compliance or routine oversight, but actual justice for people who'd been taken advantage of by someone they'd trusted. The quiet woman in the faded jeans was about to become Admiral Patricia Thompson, and Tony's comfortable little fraud operation was about to encounter a very different kind of customer. The evening news played in the background as I worked. Local stories about school board meetings and construction projects, the kind of routine coverage that filled airtime in places where major crime was rare and political scandals involved zoning disputes rather than federal investigations. Millbrook was the kind of town where people still trusted their mechanics and assumed that local businesses operated with basic honesty. Tomorrow morning, that assumption was going to be tested in ways that Tony and his crew couldn't possibly anticipate. Because while they'd been perfecting their sales pitches and training their employees to spot vulnerable targets, I'd been developing something very different, a comprehensive understanding of federal fraud statutes and the authority to enforce them. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Miss Thompson, this is Brad again. Forgot to mention something. Tony keeps all his markup calculations in a spreadsheet on his office computer. Password is Profit 2023. Thought you should know." I stared at the message for a long moment before deleting it. Brad was taking a significant risk by sharing that information, essentially providing evidence that could be used to document systematic fraud. He was also making it clear that his earlier apology represented more than just personal remorse. He was actively working to expose the corruption he'd been part of. The irony was almost perfect. Tony's operation was built on the assumption that customers wouldn't know enough to challenge his expertise or question his recommendations. He'd created a business model that depended on ignorance, vulnerability, and misplaced trust. Tomorrow morning, he was going to discover exactly how dangerous those assumptions could be when applied to the wrong customer. I closed my laptop and walked through my modest rental house, checking locks and setting my alarm for an early morning start. In 12 hours, I'd be walking back into Riverside Auto Service, but this time I wouldn't be playing the role of a confused customer needing automotive guidance. This time, I'd be there as Admiral Patricia Thompson, Regional Inspector for Government Fleet Services, with the full authority of the federal government behind me. Tony and his crew were about to learn that quiet competence could be the most dangerous thing they'd ever encountered, and that the person you dismiss as harmless is exactly the person who has the power to end your world. The woman they'd tried to cheat was about to become their worst nightmare, and there wouldn't be anywhere for them to hide once the truth came out. The small-town trust they'd been exploiting was about to become the foundation of their downfall, because in places like Millbrook, word traveled fast when someone violated the social contract, and when that someone had been systematically defrauding their neighbors for years, the community response tended to be swift and unforgiving. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, I had an inspection to prepare for, documentation to organize, and a case to build against people who'd made the mistake of assuming they knew exactly who they were dealing with. The quiet phase of my investigation was over. Tomorrow, Admiral Patricia Thompson would finally make her official introduction to Riverside Auto Service, and nothing would ever be the same for any of them. The alarm chimed at 05:45, pulling me from a dreamless sleep into the pre-dawn quiet of suburban Michigan. I'd maintained military wake-up times in civilian life, finding comfort in the discipline and the extra hours of solitude before the world stirred to life. This morning felt different, though, charged with the anticipation that came before significant operations. I moved through my morning routine with the methodical precision that 23 years of military service had ingrained into muscle memory. Shower, coffee, news briefing, equipment check. The equipment today wasn't weapons or communications gear, but the tools of bureaucratic authority. Inspection credentials, audit documentation, recording devices, and the kind of formal identity that carried the full weight of federal oversight. The uniform hung in my closet like a monument to a previous life, pressed and maintained even though I hadn't worn it in months. Navy dress blues with ribbons that told stories of deployments to places most people couldn't find on maps. Commendations for service in conditions that tested equipment and personnel beyond normal specifications. But today called for something different, something that would communicate authority without immediately revealing the source of that authority. I selected a charcoal gray suit, conservative cut, with low-heeled shoes that prioritized function over fashion, the kind of outfit worn by federal inspectors, auditors, and other people whose presence generally meant someone's comfortable routine was about to be disrupted. I pinned my credentials to the jacket lapel and slipped my identification into the breast pocket, where it would be easily accessible but not immediately visible. The drive to Riverside Auto Service took me through the same streets I'd traveled the day before, but everything looked different in the early morning light. Millbrook was still sleeping, storefronts dark and parking lots empty, the kind of small-town quiet that would be shattered in a few hours when schools opened and businesses began their daily routines. It was peaceful in a way that yesterday's attempted fraud felt even more personally offensive. I parked across the street from the garage, positioning my vehicle where I could observe the morning opening procedures without being immediately noticed. At exactly 7:00, Tony's pickup truck pulled into the lot, followed closely by Rick's sedan and Brad's motorcycle. They moved through their arrival routine with the casual efficiency of people who'd done this hundreds of times, unlocking doors, starting equipment, beginning another day of what they probably thought of as legitimate business. Through the large windows, I could see them gathering around the coffee machine, probably reviewing the day's scheduled appointments and discussing which customers might be susceptible to creative diagnosis.
Tony gestured animatedly while Rick nodded along, and Brad stood slightly apart from the group, his body language suggesting discomfort with whatever conversation was taking place. At 07:30, I crossed the street and walked through the front door of Riverside Auto Service. The bell above the entrance announced my arrival with the same cheerful chime I'd heard yesterday, but this time, the sound felt more like a starting gun than a welcome. Tony looked up from his clipboard, his face showing a flicker of recognition before settling into what he probably thought was professional courtesy. "Well, good morning. Back for more service already?" "In a manner of speaking," I replied, reaching into my jacket and producing my federal credentials. "Admiral Patricia Thompson, Regional Inspector for Government Fleet Services. I'm here to conduct an unannounced compliance audit of your facility." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Tony's clipboard clattered to the floor, Rick's coffee mug stopped halfway to his lips, and Brad's eyes went wide with what looked like a mixture of shock and vindication. The casual morning atmosphere evaporated like steam, replaced by the kind of electric tension that precedes life-changing moments. "Admiral?" Tony's voice cracked slightly on the word, his confident demeanor crumbling as he processed this fundamental recontextualization of yesterday's interaction. "You're military?" 23 years Navy. Recently appointed to civilian oversight position with Government Fleet Services. I kept my voice level and professional, the tone I'd used for delivering briefings to subordinates who weren't going to like what they heard. Your facility holds active contracts for maintenance services with federal agencies, which makes you subject to periodic compliance audits. Rick set his coffee down with shaking hands, the reality of their situation beginning to penetrate his consciousness. Is this about yesterday? Because if there was some kind of misunderstanding, this audit was scheduled before yesterday's interaction, I replied truthfully, though yesterday's experience will certainly inform my evaluation of your business practices. Tony was staring at me as if I were a ghost, his mind clearly racing through every interaction we'd had during my previous visit. The casual dismissal, the attempted fraud, the assumption that I was just another ignorant customer ripe for exploitation. All of it was being reframed through the lens of my actual identity and authority. "Ma'am," Brad said quietly, "should we continue with normal operations or—" "Normal operations will be fine," I said, giving him a slight nod that acknowledged his cooperation from the previous evening. "I'll be observing your procedures, reviewing your documentation, and conducting interviews with staff and management. I trust everyone will continue performing their duties exactly as they would on any other day." The word exactly hung in the air with particular weight, its implications clear to everyone in the room. I was giving them an opportunity to demonstrate their standard practices, but I was also making it clear that any attempt to modify those practices for my benefit would be noted and documented. Tony cleared his throat, trying to project leadership authority he no longer felt. "Of course, Admiral. We're happy to cooperate with any government inspection. We've always prided ourselves on meeting federal standards." "I'm sure you have." I opened my inspection folder and consulted the first page, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. "Let's start with your documentation procedures. I'll need to review your service records for all federal vehicles maintained at this facility over the past 18 months. 18 months? Rick's voice carried a note of panic that he tried unsuccessfully to suppress. "That's a lot of paperwork to dig through." "Government audits are comprehensive by design," I replied, without looking up from my folder. "Federal agencies require detailed documentation of all maintenance activities, including parts costs, labor hours, and justification for any services performed outside routine maintenance schedules." Tony and Rick exchanged a glance that spoke volumes about their level of preparation for this kind of scrutiny. Government contracts had probably seemed like easy money, routine work that didn't require the creative diagnosis they applied to civilian customers. They'd assumed that government oversight would be minimal and perfunctory, not realizing that their billing patterns had been quietly flagged for investigation. "Ma'am," Brad said quietly, "should we continue with normal operations or—" "Normal operations will be fine," I said, giving him a slight nod that acknowledged his cooperation from the previous evening. "I'll be observing your procedures, reviewing your documentation, and conducting interviews with staff and management. I trust everyone will continue performing their duties exactly as they would on any other day."
That's one way to describe recommending $1,600 in unnecessary repairs to a federal inspector. "Admiral, I think there's been a misunderstanding here," Rick interjected, trying to salvage something from the wreckage of their morning. "We always err on the side of caution when it comes to vehicle safety. Better to recommend preventative maintenance than to risk a breakdown." "Is that your standard policy?" I asked, turning my attention to him. "To recommend services that aren't required by manufacturer specifications?" "We recommend services based on our professional judgment and years of experience." Professional judgment. I made another note, then looked up to meet Rick's eyes directly. "And does that professional judgment apply differently to different types of customers?" The question landed like a physical blow. Rick's face went pale as he realized I was asking about their systematic approach to fraud. They're carefully developed methods for identifying vulnerable targets and tailoring their sales pitches accordingly. "I'm not sure what you mean," he said carefully. "Let me be more specific. Do you use different diagnostic procedures for women versus men? Different sales approaches for elderly customers versus younger ones? Different levels of technical explanation based on your assessment of a customer's automotive knowledge?" Rick's silence was answer enough, but I pressed forward anyway. "Because discriminatory service practices constitute a violation of federal civil rights statutes, particularly when those practices are used to defraud customers who are members of protected classes." Tony finally found his voice again, though it came out strained and defensive. "Admiral, we treat all customers with equal respect and professionalism. Any suggestion otherwise is completely unfounded." "Is it?" I opened my folder to a fresh page and consulted my notes from the previous day. "Yesterday, when you believed I was simply a civilian customer, you told me my brake pads were completely worn down and dangerous to drive. You claimed my timing belt was about to fail and could cause serious engine damage. You recommended over $1,600 in immediate repairs. Those were legitimate safety concerns. Based on what specific diagnostic evidence?" Tony's mouth worked silently as he tried to construct an answer that wouldn't constitute an admission of fraud. Behind him, I could see Rick growing increasingly agitated, probably calculating whether he could somehow distance himself from his boss's obvious lies. "The diagnostic evidence," I continued, when Tony failed to respond, "would presumably be documented in your inspection notes, along with photographs or measurements that support your recommendations. I'll need to review all of that documentation as part of this audit." "Documentation," Tony repeated weakly. "Federal contractors are required to maintain detailed records of all diagnostic procedures and repair recommendations. Surely you understand that government agencies need to verify that taxpayer money is being spent appropriately." The trap was closing now, and everyone in the room could feel it. Tony's operation was built on verbal recommendations and pressure tactics, not documented evidence that could withstand scrutiny. He'd been operating under the assumption that his customers would accept his expertise without demanding proof, and he'd never developed systems for actually proving the problems he claimed to find. "Brad," I said, turning to the one person in the room who hadn't participated in yesterday's attempted fraud, "in your experience, how does this facility typically document diagnostic findings for customer vehicles?" Brad looked uncomfortable being put on the spot, but he answered honestly, "Most of the time, we just write up the work order based on what Tony tells us he found during his inspection. And photographs or measurements? We don't usually take photographs unless it's something really obvious, like a cracked windshield or damaged bodywork." "So, yesterday's diagnosis of my brake pads and timing belt wasn't documented with photographs or measurements?" "No, ma'am." Tony shot Brad a look that could have melted steel, but the damage had already been done. His employee had just confirmed that their diagnostic procedures were based on subjective assessment rather than objective evidence. Exactly the kind of gap that federal auditors were trained to identify and exploit. "Brad," I said, returning my attention to the shop owner, "I'm going to need you to recreate yesterday's diagnostic procedure on my vehicle. I want to see exactly how you identified the brake pad wear and timing belt deterioration that justified your repair recommendations." "Recreate the procedure?" "Put my car on the lift, show me the specific components you examined, and document your findings with photographs and measurements. Since you're confident in your original diagnosis, this should be a simple matter of demonstrating your standard inspection techniques." Tony's face had gone from pale to gray. the color of someone who just realized they were trapped in a situation with no good options. Agreeing to the demonstration would expose his fraud when he failed to find the problems he claimed to exist. Refusing would constitute an admission that his original diagnosis had been fabricated. Admiral, I think there may have been some miscommunication yesterday about the specific services we recommended. Miscommunication. I closed my folder and looked at him directly. Are you saying you didn't recommend brake pad replacement and timing belt service for my vehicle? What I'm saying is that preventative maintenance recommendations can sometimes be misinterpreted as urgent repair needs. It was a masterful piece of backpedaling, technically accurate while completely avoiding responsibility for the actual fraud he attempted. I see. So, when you told me my brake pads were completely worn down and dangerous to drive, you were making a preventative maintenance recommendation rather than describing an actual safety hazard. Preventative maintenance is always preferable to emergency repairs. And when you said my timing belt was cracked and could fail at any moment, that was also preventative maintenance advice. Tony's silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable for everyone in the room. He'd painted himself into a corner where any answer would either constitute an admission of fraud or a demonstration of complete ignorance about automotive systems. "Rick," said Tony quietly, "maybe we should call our attorney before continuing this conversation." It was the first intelligent thing anyone had said since I'd revealed my identity, and it confirmed what I'd already suspected about the systematic nature of their operation. You don't keep an attorney on retainer for routine automotive work. You keep one because you expect legal challenges to your business practices. That's certainly your right, though I should mention that this audit will continue regardless of your level of cooperation. Federal agencies have procedures for completing investigations even when contractors decline to participate in the process.
The implication was clear. Cooperation might influence how the investigation was conducted, but it wouldn't change the outcome. I had enough evidence from yesterday's interaction to document attempted fraud, and Brad's information about their systematic practices would provide context for broader enforcement action. "Admiral," Brad said quietly, "can I ask you something?" I nodded, curious to hear what he wanted to say in front of his boss and coworker. "Yesterday, when you came in for the inspection, did you already know you were going to be auditing us?" "The audit was scheduled before yesterday's visit," I said truthfully. "My personal experience as a customer was separate from my official responsibilities as a federal inspector." "But now it's not separate anymore?" "No, now it's not separate anymore." Brad nodded slowly, processing the implications of what he'd just learned. "So, when Tony tried to sell you those repairs you didn't need, he was actually trying to defraud a federal inspector." "That's one way to characterize what happened." Tony exploded. "Now, wait just a damn minute. I never tried to defraud anybody. I made legitimate maintenance recommendations based on my professional assessment, and I don't appreciate being accused of criminal behavior by someone who came in here under false pretenses." The outburst revealed the depth of his panic and the fundamental weakness of his position. He was trying to shift blame to me for not revealing my identity, as if somehow my failure to announce myself as a federal inspector invalidated his attempts to cheat me. "False pretenses," I repeated calmly. "Are you suggesting that federal inspectors should announce themselves before conducting compliance audits?" "I'm suggesting that entrapment is illegal, even for government agents." "Entrapment would require me to encourage or facilitate illegal activity. I simply requested routine automotive services and observed your standard business practices." The legal distinction was lost on Tony, but it wouldn't be lost on any prosecutor who reviewed the case. I hadn't encouraged him to commit fraud. I'd simply provided him with an opportunity to demonstrate the practices he used every day with other customers. "Look," Rick interjected, "maybe we can work something out here. If there was some kind of miscommunication about the services we recommended, we're happy to provide corrective training for our staff."
Corrective training, I said, making another note. Are you acknowledging that your current training procedures are inadequate for ensuring compliance with federal service standards? Rick realized too late that he'd just created another documentation trail, another admission that their practices fell short of required standards. Everything they said was being cataloged for inclusion in my final report, every excuse and rationalization becoming evidence of systematic problems rather than isolated incidents. What I'm saying, Rick continued desperately, is that we're committed to continuous improvement and customer satisfaction. Customer satisfaction. I looked around the service bay, taking in the equipment, the workstations, the entire infrastructure of their operation. Tell me, how many customers like me have you had over the years? Customers who questioned your diagnoses, who challenged your repair recommendations, who demonstrated knowledge that made you uncomfortable. The question hung in the air like smoke, carrying implications that went far beyond this single audit. I was asking them to acknowledge the systematic nature of their fraud, to admit that their business model was built on exploitation rather than legitimate service. Every customer is different, Tony said carefully. We tailor our approach to meet individual needs and concerns. Tailor your approach. I opened my folder to a fresh page and began writing. Can you describe how you determine what approach is appropriate for each customer? Tony's eyes darted toward Rick, then toward the door, then back to me. He was clearly calculating whether he could somehow end this conversation without making things worse for himself, but every option led deeper into the trap I'd constructed around his own words. We use our professional judgment to assess each situation. Professional judgment based on what criteria? Experience, training, customer presentation. Customer presentation. I looked up from my notes. Can you elaborate on what you mean by that term?
Bread? I smiled as I deleted the message, thinking about the courage it had taken for him to make that call last night and to speak up this morning. Not everyone would have made the same choice, especially not with their livelihood on the line. But Brad had chosen integrity over security, and that choice would serve him well in whatever came next. The quiet woman in faded jeans was gone, replaced by Admiral Thompson and the full weight of federal authority. But the mission was the same, ensuring that competence was respected, that expertise was valued, and that people who tried to exploit others faced consequences for their actions. Tony and his crew had made the mistake of assuming they knew who they were dealing with, and that assumption had cost them everything. It was a lesson that would serve as a warning to others who might be tempted to take advantage of trust, to exploit knowledge gaps, or to assume that quiet competence was the same thing as weakness. Sometimes the person you dismiss as harmless turns out to be the most dangerous person you'll ever meet. Sometimes the customer you try to cheat turns out to have the authority to end your career. And sometimes justice arrives wearing faded jeans and driving a beat-up Honda Civic, carrying the patience to wait for exactly the right moment to reveal itself. 3 weeks after my audit, the local newspaper ran a front-page story about the closure of Riverside Auto Service. The headline read, "Federal Investigation Shuts Down Local Garage," followed by details about systematic fraud, violated government contracts, and pending criminal charges. The article quoted several customers who'd come forward after the investigation became public, sharing stories of unnecessary repairs and inflated bills that painted a picture of widespread deception. Jake called me the morning the story broke, his voice a mixture of embarrassment and disbelief. "Sarah, did you see the news about Tony's place? They're saying he was running some kind of scam operation for years. I can't believe I recommended that place to you." "Sometimes people aren't who they appear to be," I said, keeping my tone neutral. Jake still didn't know about my role in the investigation, and I wasn't ready to share that information. The official reports listed me as Admiral P. Thompson, and my brother had never connected that name to his sister Sarah, who'd recently moved to town. The article says a federal inspector uncovered the whole thing during a routine audit. Makes me wonder how many people got ripped off over the years. I feel terrible about sending you there. Don't worry about it. My car got inspected, and everything worked out fine in the end. What Jake didn't know was that his transmission fluid change had been unnecessary, just like dozens of other services Tony's crew had sold to unsuspecting customers. The state attorney general's office was now reviewing hundreds of work orders, looking for patterns of fraud that could support civil restitution claims. Several class action lawsuits had already been filed, and Tony's insurance company was facing millions in potential damages. Brad found a new job within a week of the closure, hired by a reputable shop across town whose owner valued honesty over profit margins. He'd called to thank me again and to let me know that several customers had specifically requested him after word spread about his cooperation with the federal investigation. Integrity, it turned out, was good for business when people knew about it. Rick wasn't so fortunate. His involvement in the systematic fraud made him unemployable at most legitimate shops, and his attempts to start his own business were hampered by his association with the scandal. The automotive community in small towns has a long memory, and news travels fast when someone's reputation gets destroyed by their own actions. Tony faced the worst consequences of all. Federal fraud charges carried serious prison time, and his cooperation agreements with the prosecutor's office weren't going well. He'd spent years building a criminal enterprise based on exploiting trust, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. Bank records showed consistent patterns of inflated billing, customer testimonies documented systematic deception, and my own experience provided a clear example of attempted fraud against a federal official. The ripple effects extended beyond just the 3 men who'd worked at Riverside Auto Service. Other local businesses began reviewing their own practices, worried that federal inspectors might be conducting similar audits elsewhere. The Better Business Bureau reported a spike in complaints about automotive services, as customers who'd previously accepted questionable diagnoses began asking harder questions and demanding documentation. My own life had settled into a new routine that balanced my federal oversight responsibilities with the anonymity I'd been seeking in civilian life. The Government Fleet Services position allowed me to travel throughout the region, conducting audits and investigations that protected taxpayer money while ensuring that service providers met their contractual obligations. It was meaningful work that used my military experience in ways I'd never expected. The Millbrook community had rallied around the customers who'd been victimized by Tony's operation, with several local shops offering free second opinions and discounted services to people who could prove they'd been overcharged. It was the kind of response that reminded me why small towns could be special places when they worked the way they were supposed to. 6 months later, I was driving past the empty building that had once housed Riverside Auto Service when I noticed a new sign in the window. Coming soon, Honest Mike's Automotive. Fair prices, real problems only. The name made me smile, suggesting that someone had learned from Tony's mistakes and was building a business model around the radical concept of actually fixing things that were broken, rather than inventing problems that didn't exist. My Honda Civic continued running perfectly, maintained with the same care and attention I'd been giving it since the day I bought it. The brake pads Tony had claimed were dangerously worn still had thousands of miles left on them, and the timing chain he'd misidentified as a failing belt continued operating within manufacturer specifications. Sometimes the best validation comes from the simple fact that nothing catastrophic happens when you ignore bad advice. The federal investigation had expanded beyond Riverside Auto Service, revealing a network of questionable practices among contractors throughout the region. Several other shops lost their government contracts, and new oversight procedures were implemented to prevent similar fraud in the future. My experience had become a case study in the importance of unannounced audits and the value of investigators who understood the technical details of the services they were evaluating. People in Millbrook still recognized me as the quiet woman who'd moved to town 6 months earlier, but now there was a different quality to their interactions. Word had somehow leaked that a federal official had been involved in exposing the automotive fraud, and while nobody knew exactly who that official was, there was a general sense that justice had been served by someone who cared about protecting the community. The lesson resonated far beyond just automotive repair shops. Teachers began incorporating discussions about fraud prevention into consumer education classes. The local senior center hosted workshops about recognizing high-pressure sales tactics, and even the Chamber of Commerce started emphasizing ethical business practices in their member guidelines, recognizing that one bad actor could damage the reputation of an entire business community. As for me, I'd learned that the transition from military to civilian life didn't require abandoning the values that had defined my career. Protecting people from those who would exploit them was still protecting people, whether the threat came from foreign adversaries or domestic criminals. The uniform might be different, but the mission remained fundamentally the same, standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. Tony's assumption that I was just another easy mark had cost him everything he'd spent years building. His comfortable fraud operation had been destroyed by someone he'd dismissed as harmless, someone whose quiet competence masked the kind of authority he'd never imagined encountering in his small-town garage. It was a reminder that assumptions can be dangerous, especially when they're based on stereotypes rather than reality. The empty building where Riverside Auto Service had operated would soon house an honest business run by people who understood that trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to rebuild. It was a fitting end to a story that began with underestimation and ended with justice, delivered by someone who'd spent a career learning that the most important battles are often fought by people whose strength isn't immediately visible to those who mistake quiet confidence for weakness. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.